Alright, hello and welcome to round 5 of the BlitzFuel Invitational 2025. As I saw in the previous few videos, we were entering this round with a plus score, something I was relatively happy about given the sequence of events that it took to get here. In round 4, I definitely could have lost at multiple points, as we saw in the previous video, and in round 3, despite having a winning position for most of the game, I very easily could not have won or even lost that game in the mutual time scramble, where both of us made several wonders, as we saw in round 3. But I also knew that the score could have been higher. I mean, losing the first round was just wholly unnecessary and just like a completely failed opening experiment where I kind of felt like if I did something a little more normal, then I would have much better chances of having a higher score coming in. But overall, I mean, 2.5 out of 4 I felt was a pretty fair result given the first 4 games. So I was mostly concerned with this upcoming game against a very strong Grandmaster Robbie Kevlishvili. He has, over 25-50 FIDE, has had good results recently, and had actually lost round 4 with the white pieces in a very surprising result and sort of uncharacteristically a difficult game for him. So I was expecting that he was going to come into this game, even having the black pieces, like really looking for a fight and trying to win, which I was happy about. I mean, at this point, with 2.5 out of 4, I would have to make 4 out of 5 in the remaining games to make a norm, which I wasn't quite ready to let go of the hope of just yet. And any realistic route to 4 out of 5, in my mind, involved winning all of my games with white, including this one, even sort of outmatched. So I was looking forward to a big fight, and that's what we got very quickly. Similar to game 1, I decided to repeat the Rory Lopez. I wasn't quite sure what my opponent would play on move 1. He has had, many games in the Sicilian, many games with e5, some scattered games in pretty much every other opening, so I didn't prepare too deeply any specific opening. I wasn't surprised to see e5, but I didn't have anything special prepared for this opponent in particular. So I figured I would reuse some of my preparation from game 1, where my opponent did not end up playing the main lines as we reached here, but I had some ideas prepared. So we quickly reached what I guess we would call the old main line of the Roy Lopez, where in this position black has tried a large number of moves. Knight a5 is the very classical approach, taking advantage, or sort of taking the opportunity to gain some time on the bishop, which now basically has to move to try to maintain any advantage, which allows black the time to advance the c-pawn and sort of indirectly challenge the center, because white will eventually have to go for d4 probably immediately. Eventually, well, I mean, even in this position, black has some options, but eventually black will retreat the knight to c6 and put even more pressure on d4. White will advance with d5, and we reach, these very classical closed Roy Lopez positions where there are many games from, not so popular nowadays, but many games from like the 70s and 80s. Another option black has is to play the move knight b8, with a very similar idea of playing c5, but arguing that the knight on a5 is sort of misplaced. Like white would eventually have to play the move bishop to c2 anyway, so after d4, knight to d7, some move like knight b to d2, c5. If white goes ahead and plays d5, then after c4, the bishop will go to c2 anyway, and the knight is much better placed on d7, where it can go to c5 and d3, for example, than it would be on a5, where it would have to take some time to go to b7 and then to c5. Another option for black is to play the sort of more active move, bishop to b7, which puts more pressure on the center. The downside is the bishop being committed to the queen side sort of lessens the defense on this diagonal, and especially the king side. So after something like d4, for example, rook to e8, knight b2, bishop f8, white can play a move even a move like bishop c2 is already interesting. Takes knight b4, for example, bishop b1, c5, d5, and now this bishop on b7 starts to look a little bit silly, where it's just sort of staring into nothingness, and the lack of presence defending the f5 square is definitely felt. White gets a very, very powerful attack on the king side. Black, of course, has better options than this, but this is one way that White can very quickly achieve a very strong position. But my opponent tried what I would guess you would kind of call the modern approach in a lot of these e4, e5 openings, which is just to play the move h6, which is sort of a generically useful move. It prevents knight g5 in some lines, it gives some space to the king, it even prepares, for example, knight h7 to g5 in some lines, while also saying that, okay, sure, it's like sort of wastes a move, like the move dedicating a whole tempo to a move like h6 is often bad in the opening a lot of the time, but given how closed the center is, it's very difficult to actually take advantage of this in any concrete fashion. And so even though White often gets objectively a slight advantage because Black has sort of wasted a move, it's often not that easy to prove in practice, where in a position where the cost of a move can usually be very, very low. So I wasn't really quite familiar with the h6 move specifically in this position. I knew it was just a general idea, but I didn't know if there was a way to sort of try to punish it or if White should just continue with the normal plan. So I did exactly that, just continued with the normal plan. After d4, my opponent played rook e8. This is one of the benefits to h6 if Black had gone for rook e8 here, which is something that is sometimes done. This does give White the option, sort of repeating the position immediately. And there are some games that just sort of end in a draw after this repetition. So possibly h6 was just aimed at trying to prevent that sort of drawing mechanism. I don't think I would have done that, but my opponent obviously didn't know whether I was just trying to make a draw in this game or playing for a win. And in a situation where he's very clearly trying to make a full point, h6 is like a reasonable thing to include. What I think I would have practically done in his position is probably played rook e8 first, just sort of to see if White was going to play knight g5, because after rook f8, knight f3, now Black can play h6 if he wants to. And if White plays d4 here, then, you know, again, Black can play h6 and rook e8, and it's pretty much the same position. In fact, it is literally the same position as what we got in the game. But in any case, I mean, through whatever machinations Black decides to do, we reach this position. I continue with knight bd2. Very typical idea in the Roy Lopez, rerouting the knight to g3 through f1. I want to play bishop f8, trying to put some pressure on e4. And now I spent quite a bit of time here trying to decide what kind of setup I was aiming for. Knight f1 is definitely the natural move. The pressure on e4 is pretty imaginary for the time being, because if Black goes ahead and takes on d4 to reveal the rook, he's not able to immediately capture either way, because White always has this very typical idea of bishop d5, forking the knights and picking up a piece. So most likely Black would play a different move like bishop to b7, for example. After knight g3, White sort of renews the defense of the e4 pawn and very comfortably gets the knight to its best square. So this is definitely the main option, probably what I should have ended up going for, but I decided to try to transpose a little bit back into some preparation that I had with a4. Now if Black goes ahead and plays bishop b7, we would reach a similar position to what we were looking at before, with takes, knight b4, bishop b1, maybe c5, d5. And this is a well-known position where White scores quite well. After knight d7, White plays the move rook to a3, a very typical idea in the Roy Lopez, sort of preparing to transition this over to the king side. And after c4, intending knight c5 and knight d3, White has a few options of how to try to get an advantage. This rook to e3 is very popular, intending to mean knight c5 with the move b3. And the rook on e3 stops the move c3, which is very important. This is part of what I had prepared for game 1, and so I figured if we transpose back into this, then that's not a particularly bad result. And after a4, Black does need to do something, so I figured, you know, rook b8 would be the other main alternative, after which we can go ahead, play takes, knight f1, and this is probably an improved version. In hindsight, I'm not really sure if this is actually an improved version. I don't know if opening the A file has really done anything for white. It's probably, if anything, it's an accomplishment for black. More likely it's just kind of neutral. But during the game, I thought I was being clever by throwing in A4. In hindsight, I think I should have just played knight F1. Especially because my opponent played a move that I didn't really consider, which was to move bishop to D7, keeping the bishop on this diagonal, after which, you know, a lot of these attacks start to feel less compelling because it's much harder to get a knight to F5, whereas if the bishop were on B7, then a knight on F5 would be much less contested and much more powerful. And so after bishop D7, I started to realize that A4 was simply a mistake. I wasn't really quite sure how to continue, so I decided I would try something similar to the lines we just looked at against bishop B7. I played the move bishop to C2. He went ahead and took on D4 and played knight B4, the very standard reaction. And here I decided to give away a pawn with bishop to B1. The idea being that we reach sort of very similar positions to before, with a couple key differences. You know, first of all, black has won a pawn by taking on A4. It's not a very healthy pawn, but it is a pawn, and it does constrict white's position a little bit because, you know, sometimes we would have liked to put something on B3. Now, obviously, it's impossible. There's also a nice square for the light square bishop, which is often black's problem in these Ruy Lopez positions, is what to do with this bishop. But on B5, it is quite well placed most of the time. But there are some upsides for white as well. Now rook A3 is never really contested. We can always plant the rook on A3 and prepare to go to the G file. We've also won at tempo in some sense because black has spent a few moves to organize taking on A4, and so white's play comes a little bit faster. And so all in all, I felt that this was at least interesting. I wasn't sure if it was good, but I thought it was a reasonable try to continue the game. So here I continued with the simple move knight F1, continuing white's plan, asking black basically what he's doing with this extra pawn. He played C5, again, standard reaction, D5. Computer gives us technically a question mark, but I think it's very consistent with the plan. The alternative is to play a move like bishop to D2, sort of indirectly defending this by putting pressure on the knight, and only then playing D5 after, for example, rook to B8, only now D5. Went after C4, which, as we'll see, is black's main idea. Now the bishop is very comfortably placed on C3. So this would have been probably a slight improvement, but I played D5 directly. Now again, black has the opportunity to go C4. We're not really in time to play bishop D2 anymore because knight D3 is very, very unpleasant, forcing off this light square bishop, and now E4 is very, very difficult to defend. Knight G3 is basically forced, and after bishop B5, these pawns may look weak at first glance, but they're very difficult to actually go collect. And so black's pawn advantage is very seriously felt here. So after C4, we would probably have to continue with knight G3. Black can play bishop B5, as we said before, very nice square for the bishop. And now again, black is ready to play knight to D3 against pretty much any move. Bishop to D2, black will play knight to D3, knight to D4, black will probably still play knight to D3. Again, there's just a lot of pressure. And even if this gives the pawn back, at this point black simply has no problems. This pawn on A4 that was very unhealthy has become healthy again, at the cost of giving the pawn back, but nonetheless, and with so few pieces on the board, it's hard to believe that white is ever going to mount a serious attack here. This should be a very clean route to equality. And if black wants to play for more, then knight D7, intending to go to D3 with a knight when at a point where it's not giving away a pawn, can be considered. It just comes at great risk with the king side starting to fall under serious attack, which unsurprisingly the computer laughs at. Doesn't really think that white is mustering enough play here. But I think in human terms, there's still some very, very serious threats. Perhaps for that reason, this knight G3, knight D4 stuff, my opponent instead played bishop B5 first, which is also fine, as long as he follows up with C4. I played knight to G3. Again, C4 is the way to go. Knight D4 is not scary, apparent to the computer after knight D7. But my opponent went for knight D7 first, trying to keep his options open, which I thought made sense during the game, but the computer really hates. I played the move knight to f5, again, I think is consistent. And then once again, my opponent is supposed to play c4, allowing knight d4, which looks very scary, but the computer just continues to think that there's just no serious attack here with the knight coming to d3. In principle, this makes some sense. I mean, this bishop's effect is completely blunted if something lands on the d3 square. And it's not easy to generate threats otherwise. I mean, this queen really has no route in. These squares are covered, and if we ever go to h5, then g6... It can become a very unpleasant fork, even if it gives away a pawn. It can also not. I mean, the queen on h5 doesn't really do anything, so black is not in any rush to evict it. And so we'd probably continue with something like bishop d2, knight d3, takes, rook e3, g6, rook to g3, and black is in time to muster a defense. My opponent played a really inaccurate move, queen to f6. Maybe overlooking my next move, or maybe overlooking my next move. I'm not quite sure. Queen f6 is certainly very natural, especially if you're looking at it from the black side. It seems active. You know, the queen can never really be harassed on f6. It restricts the ability of this bishop to move because it puts pressure on b2. It lends a little bit more support to the e5 square. It also prepares to play like g6 sometimes, even if it gives away a pawn, and just, you know, bring the queen into the defense. So queen f6, you know, in principle should make a lot of sense, but concretely there's some serious issues with this very nice move I found, knight h2, where it's starting to come under some serious pressure. White's attack is starting to come with tempo. So black is basically required to play the move knight e5 to stop knight g4. Again, black would like to put a knight on d3, after which the attack is completely over. But white has the typical Roy idea we talked about with rook a3, transitioning over to the king side and also controlling the d3 square quite heavily. Now, possibly what my opponent missed, and I spent quite a long time sort of verifying, is that after the move knight to d3, it seems like black is tactically sort of justifying his maneuvers with queen f6, because if white goes ahead and trades everything on d3, black has a very nice resource, queen takes f5, exploiting this pin. And now after white takes, rook takes e1, the knight is forced to go back to f1. Black emerges from the tactical complications basically up material with two rooks and I guess a pawn for the queen, but also a very uncomfortable king on white's side. Rook e8 and rook e1 is coming very quickly, after which white is simply losing even more material, and white doesn't really have a great way to continue the game. Queen d2 trying to harass the rook doesn't really accomplish much because the rook hides out on a1 where it can't be harassed anymore, and white is very likely to just lose the f1 knight in the game. So possibly this was my opponent's idea. But fortunately, white has tactical resources as well, which is that after knight takes d3, rook takes d3, bishop takes d3, we have the intermediate move knight to g4, attacking the queen, which has very few squares that it can go to. It pretty much only has it can go to d8, but then we take on d3 very comfortably. If black wants to maintain contact with the knight to exploit the pin, he has to go to g6, and then we have one more intermediate move, knight to h4, hitting the queen again, which at this point is completely out of squares. If it goes back to h7, we simply take on d3, which is completely winning. And if black goes to h5, then knight to f6, this typical discovered attack, picks up the queen in the game. So after bishop takes d3, black would have to improve with the move bishop takes d3 first. Now, if rook takes d3, knight takes d3, there is no knight g4 anymore because, again, this pin becomes very powerful. Now black is simply winning a rook, so there's not even a material imbalance to speak of. But after bishop d3, once again, white has a couple options. I mean, one approach is to play knight g4 here with the same idea as before. And now because the king can go to h2, this is a little bit less dangerous. White can play f6, and the computer gives this as equal. I wasn't 100% sure how to evaluate this during the game. Black is pretty much forced to play the move h5, and then after queen d2, sort of brandishing the idea of coming to g5 with the pieces, or taking and playing knight h6. Black pretty much has to give away the exchange. I mean, if we go somewhere else, then takes, knight h6. King f8, queen g5 is very difficult for black to deal with. But after giving away the exchange, I really wasn't sure how to evaluate a position like this. I thought black can even be better, because it's just very, very solid. For example, if we take and he puts a bishop on e5, it's very difficult for white to ever attack any of the pawns. This pawn is sort of cemented on b2, where it's vulnerable to attack. I wasn't sure. I mean, I didn't think white should be worse, but I didn't really see a way to be better. But white can improve once again on this whole line, which makes the whole thing moot, which is to simply open by taking with the rook. White would like to throw in the knight g4 intermezzo when there's a bishop on d3, is basically the idea. So at any point that black puts a bishop on d3, either by taking with the knight first, or by taking with the bishop, either way, white will play the move knight to g4, and now black really has nothing better than giving away the queen for a rook and a piece, which at this point is much more clear that white is maybe not winning. It's still a very difficult conversion, but very in the driver's seat. So knight to d3 it turns out, is impossible. And so my opponent found one final improvement to this whole line. You know, there's this whole dance of, you know, black never wants to end up with the bishop on d3, and so my opponent found a very clever solution, which is to do it immediately at a moment while there is no knight g4. Now, once again, if we take on d3, then black has this whole idea, because at every moment of the capture sequence there is a knight on d3 instead, which puts pressure on e1 and threatens this pin. So we pretty much can't take, but maybe this is the move that my opponent overlooked. White has a third option, which is to play the move f4, putting the question to this knight. Now at this point, honestly, I thought the game was over, because if black goes ahead and takes on b1, which seems like the only move, now after we take on e5, black cannot recapture with the queen, which is very important, because knight g4 actually traps the queen in the center of the board. Very rare that a queen gets trapped, but every square that it can go to is actually covered by a piece. So white picks up the queen and basically the game. The rest should be very, very simple. But my opponent found a somewhat nice solution, which is to move knight to f3, which I didn't see at all. Giving away the piece, yes, but not running into problems of the queen getting trapped. Now here white has kind of a few ways to achieve a very, very good position. The main one that I overlooked, I guess underestimated his strength of, was the move queen takes f3. Bishop takes b1 continues to be forced. And now after knight g4, black is forced to take on f5. That much I understood, because if he goes queen to g6, knight takes h6 comes very, very powerfully with f5, and the queen has nowhere to go. If the queen goes to either h5 or h7, then we have knight f6 with a very deadly fork, picking up the queen in the game. And if black goes back to g7, then after bishop takes h6, queen takes b2, queen to g3. Black's king is simply not long for this world. The attack is very clearly crashing through. White isn't even likely to be down material, because most likely this bishop can always be picked up. So for example, after takes, king h7, knight takes f7, perhaps, for example, queen f6 trying to aid in the defense a little bit. After check, king g8, there's many ideas, but the simplest is just to take on b1, when white is going to be up 30 pawns with an easily winning endgame, and black's king is still not safe. White can also, you know, play queen g4, trying to generate more threats against the king, and this is probably even a more concrete way to win. But rook b1 is more than enough to convince yourself that this is winning. So the queen is forced to give itself away on f5, and then after takes, king h2, rook takes c1. I missed here the very important idea, knight takes h6. Now black is forced to take, because, I mean, if black moves the king, knight takes f7, white is very clearly winning with many, many, many threats coming towards the king, and white isn't even really down material at this point. But if black takes, then after queen to g4, king to h7, rook g3, there's an unstoppable checkmate threat with this battery. So this would have pretty much ended the game, pretty sure. I mean, at this point, my opponent... I mean, the only sort of try to defend for black is not to take on c1 and not allow knight takes h6. Play a move like king h7. But after just, you know, bishop d2, I mean, white is up a queen for a rook and a very unhealthy bishop. So there's some work to be done in the conversion, but realistically white should win this without too much trouble in most cases. Unfortunately, I overlooked this knight h6 idea, so I ended up taking with the pawn, which is still strong. Not quite as good, but still very, very strong. Once again, black is forced to capture the bishop. Now after knight g4, the queen has, once again, a big question of where to go. White's plan is very, very straightforward, so just move the king out of the way and put pressure on the g-file. So if black goes all the way back to d8, then after king h2, or perhaps even stronger is rook e2, intending rook g2. And after king h7, rook to g2, black is still very, very hard pressed to defend this position. White has a number of ways to increase the strength of the attack, for example, bringing the queen to g3. White also has a number of sacrificial ideas that black already needs to consider. And white can bring more pieces into the attack with bishop d2, bishop c3 as well. So it's very difficult for black to sort of organize anything. After queen g6, which he played, there's a very concrete problem. I played the move king to h2. Once again, rook e2 I think was a little bit stronger. But I played the move king to h2. My opponent threw in bishop to c2. I think this is mostly aimed at forcing queen d2 to take the square away from the bishop. Not sure if it's objectively good, but it seemed clever in the moment. Black played h5. We moved the knight back to e3. The downside of bishop c2 is that it's vulnerable to attack this way. And after bishop to b3, I made a very, very bad practical decision here. So I saw that knight takes g7 was basically winning, sort of completely blowing up the g-file and tactically winning material. Black is pretty much forced to take because otherwise rook g1 is coming. Black can't take with the king or the queen because of the same idea. So black pretty much has to take with the bishop. And now after rook g1, the queen can't move, because if the queen moves, then knight f5, white recaptures the bishop. And then not only has white won a pawn, which is the most direct sort of implication of this tactic, but also the attack rages on. White will bring the queen to the g-file as well. Again, there's bishop c2 to bishop d2 to bishop c3, putting pressure on the long diagonal, and it's very, very unlikely that black survives. But for some reason, I got a little bit concerned here that after a move like rook a7, giving away the queen, for example, f5, bishop e5 was the main line that I looked at, and rook to g7. Here I wasn't 100% sure how to evaluate the situation. I mean, the rook on a3 is not really playing. This king is starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable because the g-file is actually being used by black in some lines. This knight is actually a little bit tied to the e3 square because it needs to stop knight c2. For example, after like takes, knight f5, knight c2 is hitting the rook, and black is recovering some material. So I got a little bit concerned here that this might not be a very easy conversion. In hindsight, not actually that difficult a conversion. I mean, this really isn't that hard. White has many more options. I mean, white doesn't need to take the queen immediately. Knight f5, for example, looks very powerful. Taking and then not playing f5, allowing bishop e5, for example, queen g2 here, and then f5 looks very powerful as well. There should be a number of ways to very easily convert this, but somehow I started seeing ghosts and got very concerned that knight takes g7 wasn't enough. And so I played a very bad move, queen to c3, thinking, well, really overestimating the amount of time that I had, because I just didn't see like a way for black to organize a defense. So I figured, oh, why not play queen c3? I mean, I can play, you know, knight takes g7 or rook g1 whenever I want. So I'm just going to play queen c3 and intend to play rook g1 and knight takes g7 and knight f5, and black won't really have a way to organize a defense. The main reason to play queen c3 is that after rook g1, which would be a much more direct approach, rather than knight takes g7, black has an important defensive resource, queen f6, and now after knight g7, black can take this pawn with check. So queen c3 is mostly aimed at preventing the move queen to f6. So black's only defensive move is queen to h7, getting out of the way of the g-file. I played the move rook to g1. g6 is pretty much forced because, again, otherwise we're threatening knight takes g7 and bringing the other knight to f5. And here I played the simple move bishop to d2, and I felt very comfortable. This much I had foreseen, because the only move that I had looked at, or well, not the only move, but the main move that I had looked at was the move bishop to g7, after which I was intending takes an f5, and it seems like the situation is completely collapsing for black very quickly. The queen exchange is pretty much forced. You can also play king h7, but we'll reach the same position either way with this check. King goes back to h7. Either way we reach this position. And then after rook a1, it didn't seem like there was a good defense to just doubling on the g-file and completely crashing through. In fact, white is very, very... I mean, even this I overestimated a little bit, but white is very, very close to winning here. Black's bishop is simply not participating in the game at all, and all of white's pieces are very well poised for a very serious attack. Plus, white hasn't sacrificed anything, so black is suffering for nothing. But I overlooked a very important defensive resource in this position, which is to move queen to h8, which is very nice. This queen has taken a bit of a surprising defensive journey, but I mean one that should be foreseen. And at this point, white's attack has completely stalled. So at this point, I really just collapse entirely. I mean, white can continue to play with like a move like queen c1, just sort of admitting that many mistakes have been made, and we're going to try to recover some time by playing bishop to c3. White retains some advantage there. It's not easy, but definitely the better way to play. Instead, I played the move rook to a1, trying to go for sort of the same plan with doubling on the g-file. But after the exchange of queens and the move knight to d3, it's starting to become clear that black has survived the attack and is starting to take over, because this knight is becoming very active, this pawn is very difficult to defend. At this point I began to understand that I was actually in very, very serious trouble, so I started looking for ways to try to bail out. One of the moves that I looked at here was the move knight to g4, which looks a little crazy, but black is pretty much forced to take because of the threat of knight f6. And now after takes rook takes g4, white is threatening to play rook h4 and pretty much deliver checkmate. The other rook is also coming to g1. There's a lot of threats. And so if black passes and plays a move like rook to b8, then even like bishop to f6 is very nice, but rook to h4, for example, would be pretty much a direct draw. f6 would be forced, hence why bishop f6 might actually even be winning for white, according to the computer. Now rook h4 is pretty much unstoppable. But more to illustrate the idea, after rook h4 threatening mate, black is forced to play f6, rook to g1, and now there's just no real way to defend this. After king f7, white gives check and then just comes back, and there will be some sort of perpetual, or a repetition, I guess, not quite a perpetual. But I ended up rejecting this because I was concerned about the move bishop takes d5. And now if I go ahead and take on d5, rook e2, the king doesn't really have a great square. Can't go to h1 because of the fork. If I go to g3, then knight f2 is also very strong, basically trapping the rook. So I have to go to g1. But now after a simple move like rook e8, rook h4, f6, there's no rook g1. And so black is very clearly cruising to victory. It turns out that I still have rook h4 here, and the game continues. After f6, rook g1, bishop f7, I kind of stopped my calculations here, But the computer doesn't actually think it's that bad for white here, because it's really difficult for black to untangle. The computer suggests the only way to actually gain an advantage for black is to play bishop e6, giving away the g6 pawn, which doesn't look particularly natural. And after h6 takes king f7, rook takes h6. White is down a piece, but with all of the activity of the pieces, white is very, very close to holding. Computer finds some ways to wriggle out of this, and black maintains some advantage, but objectively, white is probably supposed to make a draw. If black doesn't play bishop e6 and instead, again, plays like, bishop somewhere else, preventing the mate threat, then white can simply drop back with the bishop, intending this perpetual, and there's no good way for black to deal with it, because again, this pawn is just hanging. So knight g4 would have been the way to try to survive this position, but I missed the idea after bishop d5 and instead played knight g2 with a sort of similar idea in mind. He took on f5, which was my hope. I really wasn't quite sure what to do if black just played a move like rook b8, and apparently that is objectively stronger, but taking the piece is also acceptable. And after check, king h7, rook g5, which was my idea. There are a lot of threats, and the other rook is coming to g1, so black still needs to be very, very careful. For example, if knight takes f4, which would be a bit of a sloppy move, looks reasonable, defending h5 and grabbing a pawn. But after rook f5, there's just too many threats for black to deal with. And after something like bishop h6, rook takes f7, king g8, just rook f6, white is even better in this position, because one of these pieces is going to eventually fall, or an infinite number of pawns are going to fall, and black's king is just still looking for safety. So the only move for black is bishop h6, which my opponent found. It's not a particularly difficult move. And now white has two choices. I played rook takes h5. Rook takes f5 was also a little bit interesting. Black would take on f4, and white moves the king back. Now we're threatening both f7 and h5, but I couldn't find a good defense against the move rook e5, just shutting down this diagonal. And indeed, computer gives black a very easily winning advantage here. White pretty much has to take the offered rook. Bishop will take. Takes, king g8, rook to b7, and now many moves are very good for black. The fanciest is to move bishop to d1, taking advantage of the potential fork, so white is not able to capture the bishop. But even simpler is knight f2 and then knight d1, and now this very solid construction keeps white's pieces out of the game permanently. Black will very, very easily win. Also, even a simple move like, I don't know, bishop d4 is preventing rook g1 is also very strong, so it's not even like black needs to find something fancy here to achieve a winning advantage. So I ended up taking on h5 instead, maintaining this pin. My opponent played knight takes f4. I took on f5, and now my opponent found an interesting solution to all the problems, which is this move knight takes d5, giving the piece back, but getting out of any further attacks. The main alternative would be to play to move f6, and now after takes f7, rook a7 is a very nice move that defends everything. White pretty much has to like try to take on d6 or something, but even that tactically has problems with knight takes d5 and bishop f4, or even stronger knight e2 and bishop f4. So after f6, white would probably play bishop d2, trying to go after a piece. And now black has to find the move rook to e5, which is very clear now. If bishop takes f4, black exchanges a bunch of pieces, and the game is clearly over. So white has to take on f4 with the rook. And now black is not in any hurry to capture the rook because of this pin. Black can instead play the nice move rook to h5. Knight to f5 is forced, and after takes on d5, taking advantage of this pawn being overloaded. Black has very, very good winning chances. But this is not the easiest line to see. I didn't see all of these details. I thought after f6, bishop d2, I would have very, very good holding chances. So knight takes d5, I think, made sense to me in practice. I went ahead and took. And only now the move f6. Now there is no bishop d2 stuff to win a piece because we've already won the piece. I went ahead and took on f6. He played the move rook to f8. And here I made a really, really bad move. I saw the correct idea, but I rejected it. Not really for any good reason, mostly just because I thought it was a little too fancy. But the correct idea is to play the immediate rook e1, bringing the rook to the 7th rank and activating the last remaining piece for white. The whole point is that after rook takes f6, we don't take back immediately, after which black can sort of escape with the king going forward, and now after takes on d5, rook e7, king h6, there's no more threats against the king, and black is just up a pawn with very, very well-placed pieces. But to play rook e7 first, forcing the king to go backwards, and only now recapturing the rook. After which white generates, some very, very serious counterplay against this king. There isn't like any immediate attack or anything, but even after a move like king g3, for example, knight f5 is fancier, but king g3 is also perfectly fine. Rook f8, bishop goes back. It's not that easy for black to convert his extra pawn because many of his pieces are tied down to dealing with this king. For example, the dark square bishop can never really move. And white is intending not really to do anything in particular, mostly just to keep the rook on the 7th, maybe put some pressure on these pawns. And the drawing chances are very, very high at this point. I think in practice, given the time situation, black probably still wins from here most of the time, but it's certainly a much more difficult conversion than what I did, which was to trade first and only then play rook e1, because now black has a number of options. Bishop g5 is the most annoying practically, I think. I was most afraid of this during the game. Even bishop takes d5 is fine, and now not king g8, after which again white has some serious drawing chances, but the move rook to f7, which kind of shuts down all counterplay, and black is cruising to victory. But I played the move rook e4, which is basically forced, and here you played rook f4, which is very sloppy and gave me one chance to get back into the game, with the not very difficult move king to g3. I'm not really sure why I rejected this, honestly. It's possible I just didn't see it. But this is definitely by far the best chance for white to hold. Now after takes, the pawn structure is corrected, and white is maybe even better, arguably, because this pawn structure is a little bit weak and the bishop is very powerful. We have an outside passer. I mean, I guess better is a little bit strong. Like, really, this should just be a draw, but white is certainly not in any danger. And so after king g3, black basically just has to like go back, which is maybe partially why I didn't play king g3, because it wasn't really clear what the follow-up was. But white is a nice move, rook to g4. And now after bishop h6, which is pretty much forced to cover the g7 square, just a simple move, knight to g2. Bishop takes d5, knight f4. And white is once again generating a lot of counterplay. After the bishop moves, white plays rook h4. It's very, very difficult for black to make progress. White has ideas of bishop d2 and then moving the knight to exploit the pin. It's not really clear how black should make use of his extra pawn. So this was kind of my last opportunity to generate very serious drawing chances, but unfortunately instead I took in very, very serious time pressure. And the rest of this was a very, very easy conversion for the black pieces. Black is up a pawn, and so even though like some of these moves are going to get a question mark along the way, eventually he found a very nice solution, c3, deflecting the pawn for the a pawn to run down the board. If I were to take a3, bishop d4, a2, c4, bishop g7, and this pawn is unstoppable. So after c3, I was forced to give away the piece. And then there's still a little bit of hope, because if we somehow like trade these bishops off the board, then with the wrong colored a pawn and the light square bishop, there's like some possibilities of somehow limping towards a draw. But one of the biggest problems that I saw during the game was that even if we somehow get that, like even if for some reason black plays bishop g7 and we reach, some endgame like this, even this I thought was possibly winning for black, because there's like a sort of well-known construction here where Black will eventually force like a pseudo stalemate, and eventually force the b pawn to move. I wasn't quite sure of the details. Maybe this is actually a fortress. Not 100% sure. I mean, this is the sort of thing that you would eventually be hoping for. I guess even this is stalemate, so this still doesn't work. Yeah, maybe there was still actually some hope, but practically, I mean, obviously Black is never actually going to exchange the dark square bishops, and so the rest of this was not particularly interesting. Black converted very easily. The pawns on the king's side obviously are never going to survive. Black, of course, is not going to take on f4 here. That would be a very severe mistake. The white king would return to a1 after the exchange, and this is a very well-known draw, but there's no way for Black to force the king out of the corner. But as long as Black doesn't do that, which is sort of the only way to not win the position, it took a few more moves, but eventually the king was forced away and the a pawn was able to run down the board. So a very, very frustrating loss, given that objectively I had a winning position, and then objectively I had many ways to draw the position, and then even in the losing positions I was given some opportunities to get back into the game. But overall, I mean, a very bad performance from me. But well, I don't know. I was going to say, like, at least there's some positive takeaways, but there really aren't. There are basically no positive takeaways from this game. I don't think I did anything really right. I mean, the opening I didn't really understand a lot of the nuances of the move orders, and I was kind of lucky that what I did sort of produced an interesting position nonetheless. But when I had my opportunity, not even I missed it. I mean, well, I missed a couple of easier opportunities, but when I had the knight takes g7 opportunity, I underestimated it very, very heavily. I missed basically all of my opponent's ideas around, like, I missed bishop d3 entirely, I missed knight f3 entirely. I was very lucky that I was still winning after them. So overall, I mean, just a very bad game. There's really no other way to put it. So I was very disappointed after this one. Not least because this basically eliminated me from norm contention. I mean, technically, I could go 4 out of 4 from here and still make a norm, but an even score after 5 rounds, I don't think... I'd be surprised if anybody's ever made a norm in history from that sort of start. So we were back to just sort of trying to use this tournament as a bit of a turning point, ideally. Try to stabilize the situation after a very, very disappointing second half of 2024. And with 4 rounds remaining, I was hoping to just sort of get to the end with an okay score, not really aspiring for trying to rack up too many more points. But as we'll see, there was still quite a lot of fireworks to be played over the board, so no rest for the weary, as it were. And as we'll see, it didn't end up going particularly in my direction this time around. All right, thanks for watching. This has been round 5. I will be back next time for round 6 of the BlitzFuel Invitational. The remaining games, I promise, aren't going to be quite this long a video. They start to get a little bit simpler after this. These first few rounds were definitely super complicated, especially the morning round game in round 4. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for round 6.